Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to talk about the Polish presidential election. And after that, we're doing something a little bit different. This time, I'm going to interview Max because he's on a big road trip through Europe, or plane trip, I should say. And I'm going to ask him some questions about the state of affairs in some European capitals and what the mood is like over there these days. We hope you enjoy the show. Max, we now have the results of the second round of the presidential election in Poland. What's your take on what happened?
Well, first, I would direct people to the CSIS website to read your take, a fantastic piece sort of outlining what this means for Poland and for the European Union. My initial take was, man, here's a country that, has rotating, sort of midterm style elections where you have a prime minister and then you're going to have now a president from a different party. How crazy is that? And then I read something else on the internet about how Democrats are looking at the midterm elections. I'm like, oh, well, there may be divided government in the U.S. in a few years. And so I think what this means is that Poland, from a domestic policy standpoint, is going to be stuck. So a lot of the rule of law reforms are really going to be, it's going to be tough for Tusk to really push them forward. That creates some challenges from the EU perspective because they sort of let Poland off the hook in terms of the rule of law because there was an expectation that Tusk would implement reforms that would get them in line with EU directives and decisions and regulations. And now that's going to be very tough. On the other hand, I always want to push back against the doomerism of, oh my God, the EU is now back on the verge of collapse and everything is going to descend into chaos. Number one, it's Donald Tusk that still goes to the European Council summits. And so the role of the president is somewhat ceremonial. It matters for domestic legislation. And number two, I think, if there is going to be a lot of action on the EU defense level, it still strikes me as an area where there's real room for action. But this may impinge upon, the notion of Poland as sort of emerging as one of the top powers within Europe. The Weimar Triangle, along with Germany and France, really shaping the future of the European project. Maybe a bit less of this as people sort of Europeans eye, well, what's going to happen when there's legislative elections in a couple years and, the prospect for then the far-right party, PIS, to return. So, I think this is not a great outcome for Europe. It leaves Poland politically divided at a time when folks wanted or were hoping, I think particularly in Brussels, that Poland would reassert itself as a country abiding by rule of law and liberal values. And it raises questions there. But I think on the foreign policy, it's going to be quite solid. There were concerns that this guy, Nawrocki, was going to be sort of anti-Ukrainian and had sort of created some separation from the Tusk government not supporting Ukraine membership of NATO. But he just put out a very good statement about Zelensky. Poland is deeply committed to being anti-Russian, and I think, therefore, the chances of Poland really splitting or separating from Europe, I think, is in question. Anyway, I was going to have a short answer, but I went on. What's your take?
I agree with most of this. I think there are things that are not going to change for a couple of reasons. One is there's only so much the president of Poland can do versus the prime minister, as you were saying. Tusk is still the person who goes to the councils, and he sets a lot of policies. So we're talking about Poland's position in NATO, its relationship with the United States, because he also has a very good relationship with President Trump. That we know that because he visited the White House before the election. On Ukraine, for the most part, yes, I agree. I don't think that's going to change that much, but I'll put a caveat to that in a second. So those things I think are not going to change that much. Defense investment, same thing. On the rule of law, that is the worst news possible because that means for listeners who don't know how it works, just a brief nerdy moment here to explain the system is...
Nerd out.
This is what we do here. To pass the rule of law reforms that Tusk needs to pass to make sure that the judiciary goes back to being more independent because of 10 years of capture by the Law and Justice Party, or PIS, as you were saying, the president can veto these bills. And Tusk's coalition does not have a veto-proof majority in the parliament. which means that Nawrocki can just keep blocking this stuff. And that is not good news because there's still a disciplinary chamber for judges that has been very politicized. There's still a judge appointing body that has been pushing a lot of law and justice friendly judges through. We're over like 2,000 at this point, which means the more you go down this road, the harder it is to fix. So it's another 5 years like this. And of course, we'll see what happens in the 2027 parliamentary election. So that's what I'm worried about the most. On the European level, I think it's possible that Nawrocki will also dial down the rhetoric. Like he said stuff about World War II reparations from Germany, from Ukraine as well, that he could just decide to let go because he knows his country needs this partnership, especially with Germany, for economic growth, because Poland has had remarkable economic growth for the last 20 years. And he probably wants that to continue. I'm curious to see, though, on the defense stuff, for example, he has run on a campaign of like Poland first, Polish people first. And there have been conversations in Poland before of, in the defense investments, because Poland spends like 4.2% of its GDP on defense. There have been conversations of making sure a certain amount of that goes to Polish industry. And that could be a problem in all the things that you have written about, for example, on making sure that there's better cooperation across different European defense industries and not just everybody doing its own little thing, even as we spend more. So I'll be curious to see where that goes and whether he wants to at least rhetorically push in that direction. It's not like he has the power to do all this, but the president can try to introduce some laws, and it's possible the parliament would want to take up something like this. So that's kind of what's on my mind. The last thing I want to say on the Poland-US relationship, which I think is interesting, and I mentioned this in my piece, is I think this creates a new level of relationship between the United States and Poland, and that Nawrocki not only campaigned on a nationalist platform, but also on like a Catholic values platform. And that you can see a growing alignment with some parts of the Trump administration, of Trump's electorate, this idea of, Christian values, traditional values. And I think we'll see a lot more alignment there, the way we see sometimes some right-wing circles in the US praise Viktor Orban, things like that.
Yeah, there was some discussion of whether there was a Trump effect in this election in somewhat of a positive way, where I think you could probably argue maybe in the Romanian election it went the other way. But Poland is one of the most pro-American countries. There is an element of the far right and more Catholic conservative. And whether the holding CPAC conference, the Conservative Political Action Committee conference in Poland, Kristi Noem, I think, was there, and whether that sort of really outward U.S. support for Nawrocki made a difference. And I think it might have. I think there might have been something on the margin. But I think when I look at the other thing that happened this weekend, just politically quickly, was the collapse of the Dutch government, where Geert Wilders, the far-right politician that has the biggest party, was not in government, but basically collapsed the government over migration. There will now be an election in the Netherlands, probably late fall. And there, I don't know if that timing actually is going to work out too well, where the sense always is the momentum on the side of the far right. And I think what we've seen is that yes and no, but the far right has hit some ceilings in a lot of countries and has had to kind of moderate. And then when they're in government, they tend to sort of lose some popularity. So I think it's not totally clear to me where things will go. The Dutch political system is totally insane. There's like way too many parties. You have to create a coalition now. You need like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's pretty crazy. So the Dutch election is something that I think also that we'll watch. And as to look for signs of kind of, is European politics reflecting a trend that is moving in a far right direction, or is there an anti-far right direction? Is that inspired by Trump? Or is it an anti-incumbent direction of what we sort of saw over the previous years that were reflective in the US election? So lots of political machinations still to follow in Europe. Good thing is that there are elections all the time. The bad thing about those elections, at least from a Brussels perspective, is, oh my God, they're always hanging by a thread. And is the future of the EU at stake?
Especially in the Netherlands, because the math is always, as you were saying, the math is always crazy. There's so many parties and you need this many seats. But I think it'll be really interesting to see, because it kind of feels like Geert Wilders was the dog that caught the car. He wanted to get to power, and basically he did, regardless of the actual coalition. That's what he did. And he just wanted to, he just collapsed the government for something that hasn't drastically changed, that is not going to drastically change, that just is battle horse in migration. And I don't know that the public is going to see this as, well, why now? What's so different? And maybe it could be that people say, well, that's because he didn't get full power. But it could also be that people are going to think, okay, well, his promises were pretty empty. He's been wanting to do this and he has delivered very little. So very interesting to see. But let's move to this whirlwind tour that you're on right now, the Max Bergman 2025 tour of Europe. Get your tickets now. So, if I understand correctly, you were in Spain
Hmm.
and my home country. You were in Belgium as well, in two different places in Belgium. And then now you're in Norway.
Going from south to north.
Nice.
They ate lunch at progressively earlier times.
Nice. And the sun sets earlier. So
Or
what's the mood like right now?
I think if I was going to sum it up, breaking up is hard to do. That I think after the first 2 months of the Trump administration, there was a sense that we're in a total divorce in transatlantic relations. And that I think has subsided somewhat, where the question is, what are the kind of arrangements for how we're going to structure this relationship going forward? So, there's a lot of conversation both in Brussels and Spain and now here in Oslo about the upcoming NATO summit at The Hague, where Mark Rutte and NATO has sort of come up with this plan that Europeans are going to sign up to spend 3.5% on defense with an extra 1.5% in sort of magic fairy dust infrastructure spending, whatever it may be, that somehow it hits 5%. And that will hit the Trump demand that Europeans suddenly spend 5% on defense. And I sort of view this in sort of two conflicting ways. On the one hand, it sort of makes sense for Europeans to sign up to this, to kind of extend and pretend, to sort of paraphrase how Europeans dealt with the Greek financial crisis. You just keep giving Greece money. You pretend that austerity is going to somehow lead to magic economic growth, and then you just keep kicking the can. And so I think on the one hand, it makes sense to just Europeans sign up to this. There's probably not going to be a time frame to hit these spending targets. And then the hope is that by agreeing to this, by agreeing to sort of Trump's demands, that keeps the Americans in. Because look, we're doing what you say, the NATO alliance is strong. On the other hand, I think it's also going to be a reason why the United States can say, well, we can get out now because Europeans are going to spend a whole lot more. They don't need us. Finally, we've hit the point where we can now reduce our forces. And what is the Pentagon doing right now? Well, it is doing some intense planning about its future force posture in Europe in thinking about future force withdrawals. So we have this bit of a contradiction here. And what I would say, I think the concern I have in engaging with Europeans is that I think there is a general sense that, yes, the era of the kind of post 1945 American led European order is over, that Europe is transitioning to something new. Yet there's still a real attachment to just try to hold on. And so the Trump administration is being very confusing because what you hear from the Pentagon is burden shifting, U.S. forces going down. And then what you hear from the State Department, from our NATO ambassador and others, and Marco Rubio, is the kind of traditional American talking points of spend more, we're going to be there, we'll work through the force cuts with you, and also don't do anything on EU defense. And so I think for Europeans, it's a bit of a Rorschach test. If you want to believe the Americans are staying, you can find comments and other things to get you there, to say, okay, maybe it's not going to be so bad. And if you are nervous about the future of US presence and think the Americans are getting out, there's a lot of evidence to point to. And so it's leading to a general, I think, sense of confusion about what's next. Now, I think part of it is that it's really hard to design the future of European defense when you don't know what the Americans are going to do yet. So everyone is kind of waiting for the troop withdrawal conversation to happen, but that's going to happen after the NATO summit. So the NATO summit is going to be basically about very little. It's going to be a big photo op with everyone potentially signing up to this spending plan. There's some real pushback in Spain, though, because in Spain, it's not politically advantageous to sign up to, what are seen as ridiculous spending increases that aren't going to happen. And to assuage Donald Trump is not something that's popular in Spain or in Pedro Sanchez's coalition. So I think there could be politically interesting what materializes over the next few weeks, but generally the expectation is everyone's going to sign on to this NATO spending commitment.
That would be very high. Although the 1.5% on infrastructure once again sounds like something that is kitchen sink You can kind of count what you want within that for infrastructure spending.
Sure, but 3.5%, you could argue is exactly the right number. And I think it probably is. And many NATO officials are pointing out this isn't just made up. This is a real number. We've done the planning. This is what Europe needs to spend, in part because Europe is working from such a low base and Europe has given away so much equipment to Ukraine. This is what you need to spend to get back to a good, sturdy strength. On the other hand, it's more than what the US spends on defense. And while Europe is working from a lower base, it's also not trying to kind of be the master of the world and have a military that is going to fight the Chinese and the Russians potentially simultaneously. And I do think that one of the major challenges and questions is still European defense integration. Europeans are going to have to spend a lot more if they don't do it in an integrated way. If they spent money together in a cohesive way, either through the EU or just done together, then they probably don't need to spend that much. And that is currently not being discussed, and NATO isn't really going there. So this whole notion of a European pillar of NATO, no one quite knows what that means yet. So I think we're in a state of a little bit of confusion where and European leaders are pretty clear that the status quo isn't going to remain, but they're not clear on what is coming next.
So apart from defense, which I'm sure is what you're talking to people about the most, I'm curious what's on the minds of European policymakers right now as regards Europe specifically, aside from the transatlantic relation.
So I think a few other interesting tidbits to maybe shift us. Well, maybe quite just before we shift out of the defense. The other just one interesting aspect is that American officials or former American officials that are no longer telling the Europeans that all will be okay. And I think this is a big shift. That in the first Trump term, what US, so non-Trump administration officials, Republicans, Democrats that served in previous administrations would tell Europeans, look, Trump is an aberration. He really shouldn't have won. America will be back. Just keep the NATO alliance going. That is not what's happening now. And, I have sort of for a long time been like, we need to be preparing for the next thing and getting Europe prepared for what is coming, which is the US is less focused on Europe. I see it all the time. And it's time for Europeans to really take charge of their own defense. There was pushback against that when I would make that argument in the Biden administration, because Biden administration officials would be like, the status quo is great. Why would we get rid of it? It's a very good argument. It's a very strong argument. Arguing to change a status quo that's working is very, very difficult to do. But now that the status quo is changing, what you don't see is anyone saying, well, we need to go back to that status quo. In fact, there, I think, is a general consensus that if the US pulls out forces from Europe, a Democratic administration is not going to put them back in. And so what you're seeing from US officials and experts is telling Europeans, no, represents a real new era, a new shift. And we're not going to go back, in part because whoever replaces Trump is going to be of a different generation. That is quite interesting and a real different dynamic than what we have previously seen. But then for Europe, on the economic and energy front, I think really exciting things are happening. And on the energy and climate front, I think let's be very clear here. The Europeans are not giving up on the Green Deal. Any sort of notion of, well, they're starting to roll back the CSDDD, which then put all these reporting requirements on companies. Sure, they're rolling back some of the more, my green friends will hate this, more performative parts of the green agenda. But what they are not doing is rolling back the whole modernization of the European economy. Europe does not have fossil fuels. And they are moving forward on accelerating the green transition. And in fact, this is what you see with the European Union. When there is a crisis, suddenly the EU, where it had no policy competencies, it was not an energy player, becoming a major energy player. And there's now talk of an energy union, of the EU starting to fund and figure out how to create more interconnections in the grid between countries and also between the EU and North Africa, so that the EU can really accelerate. And where I think we're headed is that the European Union and China are going to be the two huge players in the clean tech space. Meanwhile, if the US does successfully unravel the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to be left behind in that sector. And you could argue, what is the energy sector of the future? It's probably not fossil fuels, which we are now the world leader in, but probably the thing that the Chinese and the Europeans are determined to invest in. And one of the other really interesting things gathered from these conversations is that The EU is setting standards, right? So this carbon border adjustment mechanism that is going to be in place in January 2026 is creating a lot of pressure on countries around the world to adopt carbon pricing. That's actively what the EU wants, is for everyone to put in carbon pricing. And what European officials I talked to were like, yeah, we go have conversations with Asian countries, with African countries, with Latin American countries, and this is all creating momentum for that to happen. And even in China, where there's going to be a big EU-China summit, the Chinese are looking at trying to make sure their carbon pricing aligns with the Europeans. And it creates sort of positive pressure within these countries. We forget that every country has politics, but positive pressure within countries, especially in China or Japan or other places where, okay, we have to now do this climate reform, this energy reform, despite our own internal domestic objections, because we need to be aligned with the European market. So I think that's really fascinating and something that I think is really undercovered.
It's always lovely to hear good news, Max. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. My green friends also would disagree with some of your characterization of this, but that's okay. I think the things that are getting walked back a little bit is more on like biodiversity and deforestation, which are also important. State that for the record. But what you said is right, is like that ship has sailed in Europe. Like people are on board. There's no trying to push back even against the pure science of it. This is the world we live in now. So I think it's good news to hear that things keep moving forward. Maybe a last question for you. I'm curious, what are you asked the most about when you're in Europe? And is it different depending on where you are?
Yeah. I mean, what I'm asked most about is what's the chaos happening in Washington? And, are you really leaving? What does this really mean? And I mean, the answer I tell them is that there is a clear effort to change the US European relationship. And I've already mentioned how the Pentagon is doing troop cuts and really wants to focus on China. And that's been true regardless of who's gone into the Pentagon. Pentagon has wanted to focus on China. You have the State Department, and it's really hard to kill talking points that diplomats have been using for a very long time. That is sort of more attached to the status quo, but the State Department has no power. And then you have folks like JD Vance in the White House that really wants to extract major concessions from the Europeans on digital, on tech policy, on trade policy, and are willing to break China, willing to use the security relationship as leverage. And so the question is, how big of a confrontation are we going to have on all these other issues? And does that then sort of bleed in to the security relationship? Where I fear we may go is the Pentagon will announce troop withdrawals, and then you would have the White House saying, okay, either make those troop withdrawals even larger, or, okay, we're going to take whatever forces we have left and then go to Europe and say, if you don't agree to get rid of the Digital Services Act, then they're all going to come home, or something like that, where we use the security relationship in a very coercive way. The other thing I would just say is that there's not a lot of coordination on policy with this administration. There is no NSC. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is both one of the strongest Secretary of States since Henry Kissinger, but then also in some ways one of the weakest, given his position in sort of MAGA world. That's just based off my sense of reading a lot of the articles and who's up and who's down in Washington. So everyone wants to try to understand why Washington is sort of giving up on Europe or turning its back on Europe. And I tell them that it's been a long time coming, that no one really understands the European Union, the European project, and we've taken it for granted. And so that's kind of the core question that I'm oftentimes, that's what everyone wants to know. And the answer isn't always satisfying. But I think what's important here is that particularly for our Eastern European friends that are the most nervous about the war in Ukraine, most nervous about Russia, is that even if you really want to believe that the relationship with the United States remains rock solid and the US will be there for you, and I hope that's the case, I don't think that you can guarantee that if the Russians came over the line in Estonia or in Latvia or Lithuania or in Poland, that the president of the United States would say, okay, we're going to send men and women to go fight the Russians to defend Narva. And if you can't count on that, then you need to start looking for other guarantees. And that I think is dawning on a lot of people, but then it takes us back to the beginning. Europe is a bit stuck because I think the reaction to then drive forward to figure out what's next is not going to really happen to there being troop withdrawals. Maybe one other just separate point is that I think there's a sense that the EU came up with all these strategy papers and strategy reports last year, the Letta report, the Draghi report, the Niinisto report, which is the former Finnish president to look at resilience, and that these are just, gathering dust on a shelf. I always found that kind of assertion rather bizarre because this was all, effectively a plot by Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission to say, okay, this is what the agenda should be for the next 5 years of the European Commission. And my understanding is that this is really driving the work of the various DGs, the various directorates of how are we implementing the drug report, the letter report, Minister report. There's, I think, a task force or working group inside of the commission to judge progress and how things are advancing. I think a lot of work is being done. And I think this is where, with Merz, the big question is, what are the things that Germany is going to sign up for, sign on for? And that will really, I think, lead Europe in a kind of new direction in its own economic competitiveness. And then maybe a final point is that what I'm hearing also from Europeans is that they're getting tons of interaction from US Asian partners that are like looking to Europe to figure out how they can engage more with the European market on trade agreements and other things, because they want to uphold the international rules-based economic order and see the Europeans as a key node to do that. And so hence you have the EU engaging with CPTPP countries and perhaps even joining, talking to the Indians about a free trade agreement. We have Mercosur, which has been agreed to and then will hopefully be ratified or potentially be ratified. So really countries around the world looking to rebalance economically toward Europe. And I think that's going to give Europe increased economic clout in the coming years. So I think, it's think tankers always want to point to bad news because it sounds savvy. But to me, from the European perspective, it seems like Europe has a clear roadmap on its economic competitiveness, is engaging the world economically as a trading power, and really has this potential capacity to move in a new direction on defense and security policy. And it's just a matter of how fast it will do so, because it's doing a lot. The EU initiatives, I think, are major steps forward, even if they aren't nearly enough.
That's a great positive note to leave it on, Max. Thank you for reporting from the ground.
It's,
on the Eurofile.
real hardship tour, going from the grid to the jamon to mule frite
to the fries.
What do we have here in Norway?
Delicacies of Norway.
Good smoked salmon and other Norwegian delicacies that are coming my way later tonight at dinner.
Well, enjoy while it lasts, and then safe travels back, Max.
Thank you. That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.